Cuba, April 1961. A botched attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro becomes an American foreign policy nightmare, the Bay of Pigs fiasco. 18 months later, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world has never come so close to full-scale nuclear war as it did during 2 weeks in October 1962. Kennedy, Khrushchev, Castro, and Cuba in this edition of the 20th century. I'm Mike Wallace. The time, January 1961. A new era begins in two world capitals, capitals of nations that once were friends. One was Washington.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
The other is Havana, where the hero of Cuba's recent revolution is now in power.
Será la victoria, patria o muerte, venceremos.
In 1961, the word charisma was just coming into vogue, for politicians at least. But if the word didn't exist, we probably would have had to invent it to describe these two vigorous young leaders, John F. Kennedy and Fidel Castro. But they were on opposite sides of the Cold War, and Castro, already a thorn in Washington's side, would soon be a catalyst for the Kennedy administration's biggest foreign policy blunder. The invasion of the Bay of Pigs was a catastrophe. 114 anti-Castro Cubans were killed, 1,100 more were captured. Castro remained in power stronger than ever, and the United States and its new president was seen as meddling, bumbling, and weak. It had all begun a few years earlier in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where Castro and his growing band of guerrillas were gathering strength for their big push to overthrow Cuba's longtime dictator, Fulgencio Batista.
We gladly suffer cold and rain and the hardship of life in the mountain. This is only the beginning. The last battle will be fought in the capital. You can be sure.
This was no idle boast. Victory for the revolution came on New Year's Day, 1959. And in fact, the cheering in the streets of Havana was met with guarded approval in Washington, in the hope that this bearded new leader would be a force for democracy in Cuba. But within months after coming to power, reality overtook optimism, as Castro established his own brand of dictatorship with palpable leanings toward communism. Middle-class liberals in Cuba had formed a key faction in the anti-Batista rebellion, and now they were outraged by Castro's betrayal of their democratic goals. Castro's response to their complaints was swift and decisive. Hundreds of his former allies were hauled before military tribunals, thrown in jail, or executed. Others fled to a life of exile in the United States. In the meantime, Castro had fallen out of favor in Washington. Top-secret discussions of what could be done to embarrass him, to discredit him, were held in the sealed corridors of the CIA. One plan called for spiking Castro's cigars with LSD shortly before he was to give a speech, so that his words would come out all babble and mush. Another plan proposed that his boots be dusted with a special powder that would cause his beard to fall out, thus stripping him of his macho charisma. Some high-ranking U.S. officials believed that Castro merited more than mere embarrassment. One of them was Richard Nixon. When Castro visited Washington in 1959, he met with the vice president. Years later, in a CBS Reports interview with Bill Moyers, Castro recalled that encounter with Nixon.
He listened to me with attention. I think that with indulgence. And then we said goodbye. Later on, I found out that immediately after our interview was over, Nixon sent a memorandum to Eisenhower telling him that I was a communist and that I had to be eliminated.
And in March of 1960, President Eisenhower authorized the CIA to overthrow the Cuban dictator. That decision, it should be said, came at a time when Cold War tensions were sharply escalating. 1960 was the year an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Russia, and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was in a bellicose mood. He not only sabotaged an East-West summit meeting that spring, but he was threatening to force a showdown in Berlin, the vital nerve center in the conflict between Washington and Moscow. The man picked by the White House to orchestrate the plan to get rid of Castro was Richard Bissell, then the CIA's chief of covert operations. In a rare television interview in 1977, Bissell recalled the mood in Washington during those waning months of the Eisenhower administration.
In the year 1960, to contemplate a full-fledged communist state just off our shores in the Caribbean was indeed extremely shocking. Everyone's used to this now. But that was a very shocking concept.
It was Bissell who decided to use Castro's own people, the Cuban exiles who had gathered in Florida, as the instrument to overthrow his regime. CIA operatives were dispatched to recruit the exiles into a secret military training program in Guatemala. As originally conceived, the modest plan called for a clandestine drop of small guerrilla units inside Cuba, where they would proceed to foment an uprising, not unlike the rebellion Castro himself had led in his campaign to oust Batista. But as time went on, it grew into a far more ambitious operation, both in scope and objectives.
Many times when the newspaper has nothing else, they invent the news.
For his part, Castro was doing his best to alienate mainstream Americans. In September of 1960, he made another trip to the States. This time he came to New York, ostensibly to address the United Nations, but he quickly turned the visit into a propaganda circus. Thumbing his nose at the posh Midtown hotels where heads of state were expected to stay, he checked in at the Hotel Teresa in Harlem, where he proceeded to court black Americans who, in Castro's view, were victims of capitalistic oppression. Khrushchev, too, was in New York that month. In fact, it was at this session of the United Nations that the Soviet premier made a spectacle of himself by pounding his fists to protest a speech that had triggered his disdain. Castro and Khrushchev exchanged hearty bear hugs on the streets of Harlem in an ostentatious display of solidarity between Moscow and Havana. Even by New York standards, their performance seemed excessively theatrical.
President Castro, would you like to meet with President Eisenhower and discuss matters with him?
Why, you ought to ask to President Eisenhower about that.
Castro, would you like to...
Needless to say, Castro was an issue in that fall's presidential race. Kennedy won a razor-thin victory that November. But when the confrontation with Castro came the following spring, the new president learned some hard and bitter lessons about the exercise of power. The central promise of the Kennedy campaign had been to get this country moving again. And those first few weeks on the new frontier were marked by vigorous, round-the-clock activity, especially when compared to the deliberate and frequently placid tone of the Eisenhower years. And the exuberant start was producing the desired results. Just 2 months into his presidency, Kennedy's approval rating had soared to 78%. But Eisenhower had left the new president with a ticking time bomb, and it was getting set to go off. The Cuban exiles had been secretly training in Guatemala under the CIA's supervision. One advantage of the plan, which called for a small guerrilla operation, was that it would severely limit the role of the United States. Whether the guerrillas succeeded or failed in their move against Castro, their efforts could not be easily traced to Washington. But Castro was training his own troops, too. CIA intelligence indicated he was in a far stronger position to resist a guerrilla uprising than Batista had been. Having learned from his own triumph, Castro was ready to crush the same kind of rebellion that had swept him into power.
In Cuba tonight, thousands of militiamen are walking sentry duty beside sandbag fortifications, The radio blares martial music. The guns point out to sea. The sea from which the government keeps saying the United States intends to invade any hour now.
The CIA strategists were confident that once a beachhead was established, thousands of anti-Castroites inside Cuba would rise up and join the liberators. The counter-revolution would be underway in full force, and Castro would be overthrown. This was the plan presented to the newly elected President Kennedy by Richard Bissell and his boss, CIA Director Allen Dulles. Kennedy's initial response was negative. Too spectacular, he said. It sounds like D-Day. You have to reduce the noise level of this thing. The top-level meetings carried over into March. Dulles and Bissell argued their case for the invasion, and not a single senior Kennedy advisor spoke out against the invasion. All were new to their jobs, and so they were reluctant to challenge the CIA officials. Kennedy said, okay, but with the strict condition that there would be no intervention by U.S. forces. Whatever happened, he wanted to be in a position to deny, plausibly, any U.S. involvement. Leaders of the brigade would later claim that their CIA contacts had assured them that if the invasion ran into serious trouble, American forces would come to their rescue. Under no circumstances, they were told, would Washington permit the operation to fail. Richard Bissell would later contend that Kennedy did not think the matter through to its logical conclusions.
If everyone had believed and admitted to himself that the U.S. would be wholly held responsible, the president probably would have canceled the operation. But what in fact happened was that we had gone along for the preceding 2 months, being over-careful not to have a white face on the beaches, not to have a modern aircraft in the air, and we had been over-careful about these things that could have made a big difference, especially the air crews, because we were trying to preserve disclaimability. We were trying to preserve something that already was lost.
But at the time, Bissell was predicting a victorious outcome, even under Kennedy's conditions. And having received White House approval, he gave the final go-ahead. The target, the Bay of Pigs, the date, April 17th, 1961. The invasion never had a chance. The 1,400-man force had been recruited from middle-class Cubans who had fled to Florida. Doctors, musicians, bankers, lawyers, artists. Fewer than 200 of them were professional soldiers. Some of the latecomers hadn't even learned how to fire a rifle. In the days leading up to the invasion, word began to leak out, first in the Cuban community in Miami and then in press reports, that some kind of military action was imminent. The word was quickly passed on to Havana, which alerted Castro and his troops to the coming attack. 2 days before the invasion, Cuban exiles flying U.S. planes bombed major air bases on the island. CIA officials told leaders of the brigade that nearly all of Castro's air force had been destroyed in the raid, and that simply was not true. Yet in spite of the intelligence failures, the obsolete ships and equipment, and all the other blunders in planning and strategy, the invaders did manage to get ashore, and during the first day of combat, they had the upper hand. Fighting more with bravery than experience, the brigade inflicted heavy casualties on Castro's troops. But that early success could not be sustained. The invaders were vastly outnumbered on the ground, and under steady attack from the Cuban Air Force, they were told had been destroyed. As their plight became desperate, brigade leaders began looking for the U.S. support they'd been promised. What they most urgently needed was air cover to ward off Castro's planes. But Kennedy stuck to his pledge that there would be no direct U.S. intervention. For the invaders on the beach, that presidential decision sealed their doom. 3 days after the landing at the Bay of Pigs, it was all over. The 1,000 or so members of the brigade who survived Castro's guns were subjected to the ordeal of a noisy public trial. And for the next 20 months, they would languish in Castro's prisons. Military disaster soon became political disaster as deniability crumbled and the heat turned on President Kennedy.
In view of the fact we're taking a propaganda lambasting around the world, why is it not useful, sir, for us to explore with you the real facts behind this or our motivations?
Well, I think in answer to your question that we have to make a judgment as to how much we can usefully say that would aid the interest of the United States. One of the problems of a free society, problem not met by a dictatorship, is this problem of information. A good deal has been printed in the paper. I wouldn't be surprised if those of you who are members of the press will be receiving a lot of background briefings in the next day or two by interested people or interested agencies. There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan. And I wouldn't be surprised if information is poured into you in regard to all the recent activities.
He knew that when the day of reckoning came, few, if any, of his advisors would be willing to share paternal responsibility for what happened at the Bay of Pigs.
The president took the responsibility for the operation. There were mistakes that were made, including the fact that there wasn't sufficient air cover for the beaches.
There is no question about the involvement of the CIA. If you talk to any of the leaders,
Reaction from the world press was not long in coming.
To have tried and succeeded would have been bad enough, but to have tried and failed is almost unforgivable. That's what many Frenchmen are saying.
A Senate committee this week figured the invasion cost at $45 million for the 1,500-man force. An administration group thinks the Central Intelligence Agency ignored Marine Corps doctrine on amphibious operations. Marine Commandant General David Shoup was never even consulted. The beaches were not prepared by air or artillery bombardment. Those able to move beyond the beaches were trapped in swamp or high growth, which was burned off, while Castro militiamen waited and watched for prisoners.
More than a year later, the brigade members taken prisoner by Castro at the Bay of Pigs were ransomed for large shipments of medical supplies and hundreds of U.S. tractors. They were cheered by Florida's Cuban community and inspired by the fighting words of John Kennedy.
Your conduct and valor are proof that although Castro and his fellow dictators may rule nations, they do not rule people. That they may imprison bodies, but they do not imprison spirits. I can assure you that this flag will be returned to this brigade in a free Havana.
But years later, the brigade leader, Pepe San Ramon, still spoke with bitterness about the way he and his men felt they had been betrayed.
I was ready to grab a rifle and fight the United States. It was a bad time for me. It was a bad time for every member of the brigade, very bad. Our hopes were crushed. For me, the government of the United States was the utmost of everything, bigger than my father, than my mother, than God. And to me, it was so low a blow. To bring you in here with so many plans and so many hopes for your country. And they knew before they sent us, in my mind, that they were not going to go ahead with it.
The Bay of Pigs invasion did exactly the opposite of what was intended. Castro was not ousted, he was strengthened. The Marxist state of Cuba, 90 miles from Florida, would survive and in fact outlive the Soviet Union. But one immediate result was to inflame the tensions between Moscow and Washington. In the months that followed the Bay of Pigs ordeal, Kennedy and Khrushchev would test each other's will in Vienna, in Berlin, and on other Cold War fronts, not the least of which was Vietnam. In time, this steady escalation in rhetoric and military posturing would lead to another far more critical confrontation in Cuba, an East-West showdown that would bring the world to the brink of nuclear war.